Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to take a look at the project configuration options for the project zone in Cubase 13. The project zone is the most important area of the application. It's going to contain your primary real estate in pretty much every project you write. So it's really important to get this stuff configured right at the outset so that once you've fixed all of your options in place, you don't really ever need to change this stuff from project to project. Hope you enjoy this video today. If you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel so that I can make more videos like this. And that said, let's get underway. Just a quick word about this terminology, just to clarify exactly what I'm talking about here. Pretty much everything that you can see at the moment is the project window. The project window is divided into zones, and annoyingly, one of those zones is called the project zone. It's really strange terminology. So in the project window, we have the left zone, the lower zone, and I'm disabling these as we go by pressing these buttons in the top right hand corner, the right hand zone, and what we're left with isn't the middle zone or the top zone, it's actually called the project zone. So this is what we're going to configure today. The first thing that we need to do is go into the project menu and select divide track list. I can't possibly imagine why you wouldn't want to do this. It just makes your workflow so much easier, so much better. By engaging the divide track list option, we're going to get a little line. See, all of these tracks have suddenly appeared. If I re-enable it, they all disappear again because they're hidden behind this curtain. This curtain allows me to separate the substantive music, the song or instrumental piece that I'm working on, from the metadata, which lives at the top. Now, I use the word metadata very loosely because you can put absolutely anything you want in either of these zones simply by picking them up and moving them over to the other side of this line. It's not really a zone in its own right, but this upper window is where I contain all of my information about the song. Without getting into too deep a technical discussion as to exactly what each of these tracks is doing, I am going to run through them very briefly to give you an idea of why they're there. At the top of the project, the two tracks that are visible more often than any other, which is why they're at the top, so that I can move this track divider as high as possible, as often as possible, are the two markers. The Cubase Pro allows you to have multiple marker tracks. I don't think you can in every version. Now, my primary marker, which is called the bookmark marker, which is a very ugly term to say, but it works perfectly well to the eye, allows me to set up these various markers, which I have shortcut keys set up for all of these. So I'm going to press the shortcut key that will jump me to marker number 5. And you can see that's just jumped across. Let's go to marker 9. It's there. So I can pick these things up and move them at will. And that just gives me lots of flexibility to kind of set temporary marker points. Really useful feature. My second marker track, which I call harmonic info, tells me all sorts of various things about the song. What key it's in, if it has keys, if it has multiple keys, I would set up new marker points to describe those changes of key. Important moments in the song, verse 1, verse 2, here's the instrumental. At the end of the song, I've actually used the word meanwhile because in the song, that's the word that gets sung at the beginning of that verse. It's actually whatever it is, verse 4. In this section at the end of the song, I've used my harmonic info marker track to tell me some chordal information. Maybe I was, I don't know, playing a solo over the top and I just wanted some visual clues as to the chords that were being played at that moment. It's a really useful thing for that as well. Basically anything that's going to help you to understand where you are in the song and some sort of contextual valuable information goes in my harmonic info marker. So those two tracks are permanently visible, and generally my divider line looks like that. Everything else underneath that divider line can be more or less useful at various points in the song. The tempo track's a perfect example of that. It's absolutely critical and has to be there, but once it's been set up, I don't really need to see it all the time. The tempo track on this song actually hangs off the acoustic guitar line, so once it was figured out and I knew what all of my tempo points were, I don't really need to see it again, so I can hide it. Similarly with my two master outputs, the master bus and the stereo out, this is a routing configuration thing. We're not going to go into the minutiae of it today, but suffice to say, this is where all of the data, where the song eventually ends up, gets routed to the master bus. I have that living up on the top shelf because it doesn't really need It's absolutely ubiquitous across every song. Every piece of music that I write has a master bus, and I don't need to see it in the main project view. Just move it up here out of the way. The next 3 tracks are very self-evident, and we don't need to spend long talking about. These are simply functional things that I might or might not use in the piece. This particular track doesn't use a chord track, so I could actually throw that one away, but it's baked into my default template. Every time I create a new song, I get a chord track for free, and then I can choose to throw it away if I want. Similarly with the time signature, doesn't really need to be there for that one for this song, but it is, and because I can move this divider line, there's no harm in it being there. This curiously named track called B major is actually a MIDI transformation track. It allows me to route a keyboard into this track, and it will turn all of the white keys into the notes of B major. If I'm not interested in playing black keys on any given day, I can always disable that function or not route to it, but it's there and it's usable. I use a program called Scalar 2 to do that job. And then finally, this folder underneath does actually contain song information. These are tracks that currently aren't used, and as you can see, they're all muted. Don't need them, don't want to see them. If I was re-recording the vocals, I would get my guide vocal line back out. This contains MIDI note information telling the vocalist, my wife Pauline in this case, which notes to sing, and so really important, but once it's been used, it's done and I don't need to see it anymore. So I have this track called Unused, this folder track, into which I throw all of the stuff that I just don't need to see permanently. Generally speaking, I prefer to use this rather than the visibility tools. I will use visibility tools, and that's a discussion for another day, but I do like this temporary holding area of having this unused folder. So all of that stuff is really great. It helps me to kind of keep my project nice and clean, and then I move my divider line up to hide most of it, and now I can get on with the main part of the song. The next thing to have a look at is track height. You can see each of the tracks in my main project is basically 2 rows high. Now I have keyboard shortcuts set up for 1, 2, 3, and 4. My default is 2. That allows me to see a nice amount of information on audio tracks so that I can kind of visually see what's going on with the song. This is a really nice kind of visual cue, but they're not taking up too much space, and it's a nice compromise. As far as the metadata tracks are concerned, however, you can see that they're all only 1 track high because they don't really need to be any bigger. Perfectly happy with them at that height. One of the advantages of having your track divider is whichever window zone you select, so I've now selected into the upper window, if I do my track resizings, that's going to operate on just the upper window. Select a track in the lower zone. I'm using the words zone and window interchangeably, and I shouldn't really. These are windows, the upper window and the lower window inside the project zone. So it's another convenient thing to be able to divide these 2 areas and apply different logic to them. We go right down to the bottom right-hand corner of the project window. We've got this track height presets. There's a tiny little white arrow. Can you see the mouse? These zoom tracks 1, 2, 3, and 4 are what I'm using to accomplish that. They are also accessible from keyboard commands. That's where I've got my shortcuts set up. And here they are, zoom tracks 1, 2, 3, 4. There's my keyboard shortcuts. With the release of Cubase 13, we do actually have a different means of zooming around the project, and this is something that's worth taking a note of. We've always had the ability to press the Control key down on our PC keyboard, and then I can zoom with the mouse to go in and out horizontally. That's great. But now if I press Control Shift and use my mouse wheel, I zoom vertically. So that's a new feature and really good. It might actually subvert the need for me to have these 4 track height shortcuts. I'm so used to using them, I can imagine them staying, but I can also imagine using this Control Shift Zoom feature an awful lot. It's a really nice addition. The final point I'll mention about track heights is that when you adjust track heights globally using these keyboard shortcuts, they apply to all currently visible tracks. So I've currently got this Harmony 2 track enabled. I'm going to open an automation lane, and here's the volume. You see that that volume is only 1 track high. If I now reset the project so that all tracks are 2 zones high, Harmony 2 will remember that that's how big its automation lane is. But if I had an automation lane, say harmony 4, that hasn't previously been set, that's still set to 1. So these zoom operations only operate on visible tracks. Now, if you've got lots of automation in your project and you want to resize all of the tracks simultaneously, let's say you want to set everything back to a default of two rows high. A nice way to do that is to right click on any track and say show all used automation. Click that button. That brings up anything that's visible. You can see this track here has some automation on. Now I can press my shortcut. I can, of course, then hide automation, throw all of that stuff away, and I know that any track that has any automation lanes on, when I open them, they're going to be the height that I want them to be. Now we get on to configuring the tracks themselves. You see all of this information. You can see mutes and solos and all sorts of different buttons. You can configure all of those options on a track type basis. If you go down to the bottom right hand corner of this left hand area of the project zone, you've got this little settings cog, open track control settings dialog, and this is where we're going to configure these options. I'm actually going to use the example of instrument tracks today to walk you through all of these different options. Just before we get underway though, I'll just mention, draw your attention to a very small bug. If I click the video button, can you see that these options are associated with video tracks? I'm going to close the dialog down, reopen it, and it looks like audio contains these functions. It doesn't. It's simply not selected the correct tab. If I single click audio, these are the features for audio tracks. Don't inadvertently kind of set the wrong track because you think you're looking at this and you're actually configuring video tracks. Okay, onto instrument tracks. Let's have a look at what's going on. So we have hidden controls and visible controls. Pretty much stands to reason. You can see the visible controls, and this is your available pick list. If I want to add lock to an instrument track, so piano chords down here is an instrument track. If I click apply, there's the little lock symbol just appeared, and throw it away again, and it will disappear again. The reason it appeared down on a row on its own is because this track is currently maxed out. This is as wide as this track can display any features. If you add a new function, it's basically going to wrap around. The width of that track is determined by the controls area width, this number 14 here. If I make that smaller, you'll see that some of these buttons at the right hand side are going to pop down onto a second row, and that just happened. So 14 has been kind of carefully curated by me to be this absolutely minimum amount of area that I need to show all of my functions. I don't actually like buttons appearing on this second row. I just like to have them all clustered together. Purely a matter of personal choice. If I can pick up this curtain, you can see that I have the freeze button just about visible. Once I've set up that curtain, I will then basically save these options into my default template, my project template, so that every time I open a new project, the width of this area is going to be exactly what I want it to be. Back into the settings we go. The track name width is currently set to 6 blocks. It doesn't mean 6 pixels or 6, it's basically 6 default units. You can see these little squares. If I make the track width wider, let's make it 8. This is global, so every track name is now going to get bigger. And there it is, suddenly got some extra space. And if we can't fit all of our controls, you can see they pop down onto the lower row. Set it back to 6. Then record, enable, and monitor are both set in group 1. So here's our instrument track, here's my record, enable button, and here's my monitor. Those two functions, those two buttons are basically stuck together. That's because they're currently in a group. So I selected record, enable there, and it highlighted the entire group. If I click ungroup and apply, these two functions have now been separated, they've been split up. Let's join them back together again with them both being selected. So I'm going to like record, enable, I'm going to hold the control key down, select monitor, the group option becomes available, select group, and you can see that it's auto-assigned the number. So you don't select these numbers, it's basically just an ordinal value. Cubase takes care of that for you. Read, write, enable is a button all on its own, so that functionality isn't directly connected to anything on either side. But then the next two functions are, so they're grouped together. Lane display type is this little feature that lives on its own. And then finally the freeze button, which is this one here. Instrument tracks are the widest tracks. in any instance of Cubase for me, and so that's where I determine the width of my curtain. Once you've specified all of those options, you can save that as a preset. Now I actually have a preset called Anthony Track Controls. Yeah, there it is, which I can't currently get to. And there's this kind of annoying thing with the interface that if I want to save the preset as it currently stands, I have to click save and then remember what the name of my track is and type it in order to overwrite. These presets that you can't see physical files for, they're actually baked inside something else. So they'll live inside maybe the project file or some kind of area inside Cubase that doesn't have its own dedicated XML preference file. So it's very difficult for me to share this stuff. So let's cancel out and have a look at some of that functionality from the other perspective. Why are those buttons so important? I actually have them visible in the interface all the time. Well, Record Enable completely speaks for itself. There are many occasions where you're recording some information, maybe via a MIDI keyboard, and you want to send it to 2 tracks simultaneously. That's really easy to do by simply record enabling both tracks. Similarly with the monitor, if I press the keyboard and I want to hear like 3 separate instruments simultaneously, I can engage monitoring on all of those tracks. The tracks will hear that MIDI data and throw it back to my ears. Read and write automation, available on every single track, a completely intrinsic and absolutely essential part of your workflow. Then we have channel settings. This is where your inserts and sends are going to live. It's really convenient to have an easy place to jump to this stuff. If you have instrument tracks, you want to be able to edit your instrument very quickly. And when I say very quickly, I've just opened an instance of Omnisphere, so it took a while to load up, but this is my piano. The show lanes button is also really important, more for audio, I would say, than MIDI, but I do use it in both contexts. If I'm recording in a loop and I'll record multiple takes, I'll just let the lanes build up. I use lanes to record multiple takes rather than track versions. That's just my preferred workflow, and so I want to be able to see all of those multiple instances of the recording. Finally, if my project's getting a little bit stressed, let's have a look at the performance meter. So at the moment, my project is very comfortable in this particular song, but if my peak is getting up a little bit past 50% and starting to show signs of the project kind of stressing my system, I can freeze tracks. And this is something I want to be able to do pretty much at a moment's notice. All of these functions I want permanently available. So if I need to freeze this piano track, just to ease the CPU burden, the button is right there. That would disable the VST instrument, unload it from Cubase, or give me the option to unload it from Cubase. And from that point onwards, Cubase will simply be playing back an audio file rather than the heavy-duty processing of generating this very kind of intense piano sound. So all of those functions are super useful, really important to me. Like I say, as a matter of personal choice, I don't like to have controls wrap around onto the second row. If, for instance, I'm in truncated view, where I'm looking at all of my tracks at only one unit high, I do not want to lose functionality. I still want to have access to every button. That's why it's important to me to have them horizontally available like this. And I set my curtain width appropriately. You see that? There we go. Just make that freeze button appear. You can assign track pictures to each one of your instrument types. So if I enable track pictures, which as you can see, I don't currently have enabled, this little highlighted box appears. I can now double click in that box and select if this is a guitar, for instance. I would scroll down and find the guitar and select it, and that's what you can do. I don't use them, so I don't like to have those little highlighted boxes kind of permanently visible, and so I can hide track pictures. A couple of very quick points to mention just before we call it a day today. I'm going to pull this window down, and as I do, can you see on the right hand side, it's not hidden by my head, that little scroll bar appeared. If you set your track height sufficiently small, the scroll bar will disappear. Just a word of warning, not to try to move tracks around if your track height is too low. The auto moving feature in Cubase is really difficult to navigate and very kind of cumbersome. So if you're going to move tracks around, make sure your track height is nice and comfortable so you're not bumping into those upper and lower zones, because the zooming is just a little bit fast for my liking. I find it a bit tricky to work with. And finally, channel visibility, we've got a button up at the top of the window called Set Track Type Filter. If you enable that, this enables you to basically throw away entire types of tracks. So if, for instance, you don't want to see your MIDI tracks visible in the project, this is a way to make them disappear very conveniently from the primary interface. I almost always leave all track types enabled. The only thing that I do in the mixer, I quite frequently hide MIDI tracks, because in the mixer they don't actually have very much use at all. You very rarely mix a track using a MIDI track. But as far as my project's concerned, I want to see everything all of the time. And as you can see, I've got all of my filters visible. And that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.